So I'm going to start that now. Um,
Okay,
so
actually, why don't we take questions all along instead of waiting till the end like I suggested?
sure. Okay.
Yeah, it's a smaller group. It works pretty
Okay.
well.
Great, thank you. So I'll go ahead and introduce you, and this is what I pulled from your LinkedIn profile, Dr. Frelich, so please correct me as needed. Dr. Lee Frelich is director of the University of Minnesota Center for Forest Ecology. He received a PhD in forest ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1986, teaches courses in forest fire ecology and landscape ecology on the St. Paul campus, and has advised more than 20 grad students. Dr. Frelich has authored more than 150 publications and has provided consulting services on forest management for many government agencies. Current research interests include effects of large-scale fire, impacts of invasive earthworms, impacts of deer and moose browsing, and climate change on forest ecology. So welcome, Dr. Frelich, and please add anything else that you would like to add to your bio.
Oh, I think that's fine. So thanks for inviting me. Let me just do the share screen here, um, which worked before, so it should work again. There we go. So the the forest type of relevance here, given the watershed district, is the big woods, and these are basically maple, basswood, and red oak forests. And here's an example of what one looks like. They very rarely have fires. Most of the disturbance is in the form of windstorms that can blow down scattered trees here and there, or can blow down the whole forest, but they sprout right back up. They have very high diversity of plants, as you can see, can be very lush. And this is what a big woods forest should look like in this picture. If your forests don't look like this, there's something wrong with them. And my guess is there probably is something wrong with a lot of forests in your watershed district, and that's what we're going to talk about. Why are they losing their natural function? They can absorb and store a lot of water. They prevent soil erosion when they're in their natural condition. That's not so much the case anymore with a lot of the degraded forests, especially in the metro area. And that's what I'm going to talk about why that is today. So there's conservation problems, invasive species, especially earthworms, that we'll talk about. And then there are things like buckthorn and garlic mustard. I'm sure you've heard of those. Overpopulations of deer, fragmentation and habitat loss, so the forests don't cover the proportion of landscape they used to, and then climate change. And these four problems lead to not only poorer ecosystem function in terms of water quality and wildlife habitat and all those services, but they also lead to extinction debt, and I'll tell you what that is as we go. This forest type all through the Midwest has what's called an extinction debt, and I'll let you puzzle about that a little bit and come back to it later. So first, let's start with the earthworms. So invasive earthworms are probably the invasive species problem with the biggest spatial extent worldwide. They literally cover whole continents, and there are invasive species just about of earthworms just about everywhere. Here you see us sampling earthworms in the field. You can sample them with water with mustard powder in it, using that high-tech item you see there, the empty milk jug. About a third a cup of yellow mustard powder in a gallon of water, and you pour it on the ground like you see in the lower left picture there, and then you just wait and they come to the surface, and then you can grab them, and then you can, if you do a bunch of samples in a given forest, you can extrapolate from the area of the samples to the area per the number of worms per acre. In this area, we're usually getting about 100,000 night crawlers per acre, and those are from Europe, and maybe 300,000 or 400,000 other invasive earthworms per acre in most of our forests here. And so here you see the night crawler, which is our biggest invasive earthworm species, and you're familiar with them because they're used as fishing bait. But there's a lot of other species. We usually find 7 or 8 species in a given forest. The nightcrawler's relative, Lumbricus rubellus, looks like a baby nightcrawler, but it's actually a different species. It eats the leaf litter in the forest floor, even the old leaf litter. All of our forest floors used to be 6 inches thick, and they were like walking on a memory foam mattress. And so Lumbricus rubellus comes and it eats that, and that's like 100 years worth of leaf litter. And then the night crawlers eat all the fresh leaves that fall each autumn. They don't eat them all in the autumn. They eat a lot of them the following spring into early summer, so that you get bare forest floors by midsummer. And then we also have these endogeic species, which are the ones that live in the ground all the time. And they're the most numerous. Aporectidea is their genus. There are probably several 100,000 of these per acre in all of the forests in any given watershed district in southern and central Minnesota. So they do a lot of things to the soil. Those endogeic ones, which are also known as angleworms, they burrow continuously through the soil. Essentially, the top 18 inches of soil is a 100% earthworm castings or earthworm poop from those endogeic species. And it has a much higher bulk density than the native forest soil. And so that does make rainfall penetrate more slowly into the soil. And so there's less infiltration of water and more runoff and more erosion. There's both sheet and gully erosion. And in the absence of the thick organic horizon made of leaf litter, the surface of the soil is open to erosion. So the soil structure and bulk density has changed. The organic horizon is gone. This leads to the leaching of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium from the soil. And so the forests become more nutrient poor. They grow less. The temperature of the soil is about 8 degrees warmer at midsummer than it would have been before the earthworm invasion. So the root systems of the trees in your forest have already experienced the level of climate change that we expect by the end of the century. Even though the tops of the trees have not experienced that yet, the roots already have, because that's how much the worms warm up the soil. And that's because the leaf litter would be insulation, and also because the higher bulk density means better transport of heat into the soil during the summer. That alters the microbial communities and the entire soil food web. That alters the habitat for plants, affects their populations. And when you change the plant community, you change the habitat for wildlife. So you see here some of the concerns with earthworm invasion. Disease dynamics, for example, they affect tick habitat on the forest floor, especially for the ticks that carry Lyme disease in both positive and negative ways. We're not even sure what the exact net balance is there. They facilitate invasive species like buckthorn and garlic mustard. I already mentioned they change community composition of the plants and wildlife habitat quality. They reduce forest productivity. They can also reduce crop productivity because earthworms facilitate buckthorn. Buckthorn is the overwintering host for soybean aphids, and soybean aphids are a major pest on soybeans. So they affect soil and water quality quite a lot. And again, you are going to get either erosion of the nutrients in this box here, NPK, calcium, and magnesium. You're either going to get erosion of that off the top of the soil, or leaching down through the soil profile into the groundwater, and from there into surface water. So you will get some eutrophication of water caused by earthworms, even in a completely forested watershed. And of course, all that forest floor material they're eating is turned into CO2 because they're respiring it. And so when you look at all the earthworm invasions worldwide, they're a big source of CO2 to the atmosphere. And then they even influence the disturbance regime. Without the leaf litter layer, you can't do a prescribed burn, which is something forest managers would like to do in order to increase the proportion of oak in forests. And of course, the higher bulk density of the soil means trees are a little bit more wind firm. Is an unexpected consequence of worms invasion. And this just shows the results from a study of sugar maple forests. This is in northern Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan, but it works the same in the big woods here in Minnesota. And the graph just shows cumulative growth of trees from 1950 up into the early 2000s. And these top 4 lines are the early stages of earthworm invasion. The thick line here is the growth rates of trees that are in stage 5 of invasion, which means that it's dominated by the nightcrawler and they have bare forest floors at midsummer. And you can see about a 30% reduction in the growth of trees. And that's because the root systems have been disrupted. The mycorrhizae the trees need have been disrupted by the earthworms. A lot of those mycorrhizae live in the organic matter or the leaf litter. And because the soil is warmer and drier, the trees are experiencing more drought stress. And then, of course, the nutrient shortages. And for sugar maple, especially calcium and magnesium make a big difference. So we're getting less productivity of trees in earthworm infested soils. And then among the plant species, there are winners and losers. The winners are the grass-like, the sedges like Pennsylvania sedge. Although if you have enough shade, you might end up with a completely bare forest floor and hardly any plants at all. The losers are things like our native orchids, trilliums, violets. A lot of the native plants are losers in this whole change in the environment. It's not that they can't grow there, but they can't grow quite as well as when the soil was cooler and more moist and more nutrient rich. They can still grow there, but the standing crop in most cases is wiped out when the earthworms first invade, and there's no seed source to get them back in after that standing crop of all the native plants has been disrupted. Let's see. Oh, and then facilitating buckthorn. So this is a November picture of a buckthorn invasion front coming through a forest that's earthworm infested. And there's leaves on the forest floor because they just fell off the trees because this is a November picture. But buckthorn is proven by one of my PhD students to be dependent on earthworms. Buckthorn and garlic mustard, in fact, as well as Tatarian honeysuckle and barberry and most of the invasive plant species. And that's because the earthworms and those plant species are co-evolved on their home continent and they have a symbiotic relationship. In Europe, you only find about 1 buckthorn per acre, if that, or 1 every 5 or 10 acres. And about 1/10 the density of nightcrawlers you have here. And that's typical that as invasive species, they're more abundant in their new continent than their home continent. So the nightcrawlers go crazy with very high densities, and so does the buckthorn in North America. Then so that was the European worms. We now have the jumping worms coming in, which are Asian. There's about 14 species in North America. We think about 3 of those are in Minnesota. Amynthus especially, Amynthus agrestis is the most common. They don't move around as fishing bait so much as they move around in mulch. And so what happens is they get in the mulch in gardens adjacent to a forest and then go from there into the forest. They're more aggressive than European worms. They're annuals. They aren't perennial like the European worms that survive winter by going deep in their burrow below the frost line. They lay eggs in the fall and survive the winter exclusively as eggs, which are in silken cocoons. So they're annual species. And I should say they turn the soil into very loose, small aggregates about the size of cat litter, 2 or 3 millimeters, eighth of an inch maybe in size. And that can be 6 inches deep, and it's just totally loose on the surface. So the European worms compact the soil, the jumping worms decompact it, but they only decompact the top 2 or 3 inches. The night crawlers disappear. They can't compete with these Asian worms. And then you have this situation where the endogeic European worms that compact the soil persist underneath. So you have hard soil underneath with very loose soil like cat litter on the surface. And this, of course, is very much facilitates an even more rapid rate of soil erosion than was caused by the European earthworms alone. So we expect the jumping worms to hugely exacerbate the rate of soil erosion. They seem to like east and north facing slopes the best because they only live in the top 2 inches of soil. They like cooler sites, but a densely forested site facing south or west can be colonized as well. Whereas they won't colonize open lawns and they won't colonize open or treeless south and west facing slopes. And you can see from this picture here, we found a lot of places where we've had 4 or 5 inches of soil loss. And they also reduce native plant species richness, as do the European worms. And so these are species richness curves from the University of Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. The blue line shows the species richness, and this is at 10 hectares, which is 25 acres up here at the top of the curve. For areas infested by the European worms, and then they had some small jumping worm infested sites that get up to 7.5 acres total size there. And there's about 25 fewer native plant species there than in a comparable area that just has European worms. And we think the areas with European worms are 30% less than what it would have been in a completely natural forest. So it's a big hit to plant species richness. Both of these waves of invasion, the European first wave of earthworm invasion and the jumping worm second wave of earthworm invasion. And of course, the lower the plant species richness, the less functional the ecosystem is, the less it can control erosion, the less it can hold the soil, the less it can absorb and hold water, and the less the trees will grow. Because it all really does all work together. The understory plants and the trees and the soil all works together as an ecosystem. These are just some of the cascade complexes caused by earthworms. Every arrow on this diagram here is either somebody's master's thesis or one paper from somebody's PhD thesis in order to put this whole picture together. So among other things, they favor ragweed, giant ragweed especially, which is great for hay fever. And allergies, they influence ticks, which influence Lyme disease. They are the cause of buckthorn invasion and aphids and Asian lady beetles that reduce crop productivity. They cause the loss of nutrients, which causes water quality problems and reduces forest productivity. They change fire, the ability to fires to spread through the forest. They cause drought stress. And so they have influences on human health, the economy, and the environment. Okay, so that's worms and buckthorn. Let's go on to deer. There's a certain level of deer that's healthy for a forest around 4 or 5 per square mile, we think. A lot of our forests in the metro area have 15, 20, 25 per square mile. This is one of my graduate students, David Augustine, from way back in the 1990s. He wanted to know what the deer influence was during the summer, and the DNR only gives you a winter measurement of their density. So he put cameras on trees, 6 trees in each woodland that he studied, and moved them around every 2 weeks throughout the summer, and ended up with lots of pictures of school kids on field trips. But at 3:30, the kids go away and the deer come back. So number of deer photographed per week per camera is a measure of the deer activity in the summer. And what we discovered in an experiment where we found pairs of trilliums and protected one of each pair with a wire cage is that after 2 years, 75% of the protected ones were blooming and getting seeds, whereas the unprotected ones only had 3% getting a flower. So the deer really do negatively impact the plants, and I just told you a few minutes ago that the earthworms also negatively impact trillium. So you have a double whammy for a lot of our native plants, like trilliums, like yellow lady slippers, all the native orchids, a lot of the native plants, that the earthworms reduce their the number of plants, and then you still have the same number of deer, so the deer to plant ratio goes up. And I'm going to show you how that works. So here's a wood nettle, which is one of our main native plants. Deer love to eat it. Eating raw nettle with the stinging hairs might not be attractive to people, but deer like it. And you can see they just rip off the top part of the plant. And it turns out that the higher the density of wood nettles, the less the proportion are grazed by deer. So it's possible to have a forest with, say, 500,000 wood nettle plants per acre, and the deer can eat as much as they want, even if there's 25 per square mile, and they'll get as much food as they need, and there'll still be millions of plants left over in the forest. But as you get down to lower densities, the impact of the deer on each stem goes way up. And when the earthworms invade, they reduce the density of the number of native plants. The more the earthworms lower plant density, the easier it becomes for deer to locally eliminate the plants, because you're going from a plant density like 15 or 20 here per square meter down to just 1 or 2 from the earthworms, and then the deer can finish off the rest, and you end up with one of these forests with just bare soil. So if you have a low deer level, we discovered you only need like 40 plants per acre, and they can continue to grow and the deer won't eat them all. Medium deer, which is typical for this area, you need 400 per acre. And if you have high deer, you need 2,400 plants per acre in order for the plants to grow faster than they're being eaten by the deer. So if you have an earthworm invasion in an area with high deer, you probably won't have 2,400 plants per acre after the earthworm invasion. You might only have 40 or 50 or 100, and the deer will eat the rest, and you'll end up with no plants. And that gives you the difference between a forest like this, which is in the Cannon River Wilderness down by Cannon Falls, Minnesota, or a forest that looks like this, which is hit heavily by the worms and the deer. And as you can see, you're no leaf litter, no plants. You're going to get a lot of erosion here. And then if the jumping worms invade, that erosion will accelerate another order of magnitude. So that's the deer. Then there's fragmentation and habitat loss. These forests used to cover millions of acres. We only have about 2% of the big woods still remaining. And in the metro area, you just have these little fragments. It's great for that one local little area, but it doesn't have the positive impact on a watershed scale or a landscape scale that there would have been in the old days when there was a lot more natural vegetation. And of course, species can go extinct just because of habitat loss. If you reduce the habitat by, let's see, 98%, like has happened with the big woods, then about 50% of all native species would eventually go extinct. And that's all taxonomic groups: plants, animals, insects, fungi, everything. And you can imagine the loss of ecosystem function that you would get with that. Not that the worms and the deer aren't already degrading these little remnants in the metro area to the point where they've already lost more than 50% of their species. But even if that hadn't happened, eventually they would go extinct just because they become genetically isolated and can't cross-pollinate from one woodland remnant to another. So the big woods this is natural areas in Minnesota. And you can see this whole southern Minnesota area here. That's not like speckles of dirt on the screen. That's like the actual size of the natural areas in southern Minnesota. So very small and isolated, very susceptible to the earthworm impacts, the deer impacts, and fragmentation and genetic inbreeding and loss of species through that mechanism as well in the entire big woods region. And if you have isolated natural areas, which is what we have in the metro area, you want dynamics like this one in the lower left, patchy population, where there's enough remnants that most species can get between them quite easily. You can get crossbreeding. Individuals can go, either animals can directly go to the next patch of habitat for plants, either the pollen or the seeds can get across. You can also have a source sink like they have in southern Wisconsin, where the Baraboo Hills has like 30,000 acres of forest, and they provide seed sources and offspring of songbirds to all the other little tiny forest remnants in southern Wisconsin, and they're never successful there. They just keep getting refed by the kind of the mother patch. But I think what we're starting to develop in the metro area and in a lot of southern Minnesota, where the woodlands are separated by miles of cornfields, is this situation on the lower right, where it's just too little connections. Maybe a few species can cross, but a lot of them can't. Trilliums are dispersed by ants. Typical dispersal distance is about 1 meter. So no way is an ant going to pick a trillium seed and walk across a cornfield to the next woods with it. So I think this situation where a lot of the species are isolated with no interaction is happening. With some species, though, there are interactions. For example, oak, because blue jays pick acorns and fly up to 2 miles with them, and they do thousands of acorns. Each blue jay just thousands of acorns every year. So they're getting around quite nicely from one woodland remnant to another, but not so for trilliums and lichens and other smaller things that can't disperse. If you look at isolated remnants, and I think this shows forests in Wisconsin, where they took a sample of forests way back in the 1940s and 50s and then revisited those same forests 50 years later. And again, this is in a landscape where they're isolated by cornfields, basically, and in some cases, suburbs, a 25% loss of all species. And even northern Minnesota had 19% loss of species, and that was probably not from fragmentation, but probably because of the deer and the earthworm invasion. Whereas in southern Wisconsin, that loss would also include fragmentation, the impacts of fragmentation. Okay, now let's throw climate change into the picture. Um, so some research that I did, this is Ryan Toots' master's thesis. He's working in state and private forestry, I think, on St. Paul campus for the Forest Service lab. So we mapped out what makes boreal versus temperate forest biome. It turns out it's mean summer temperature. With cooler mean summer temperatures, you get boreal forest, which is shown in blue here. And then the minty green is mixed boreal and temperate. And then if summers are warm enough, say like 68 degrees mean summer temperature for June, July, and August, it's going to be temperate broadleaf, maple, oak, and basswood, basically, which is the yellow. And then prairies, it turns out, grow in the prairie biome has a deficit in the annual water balance. There's more evaporation than precipitation. So if there's more precipitation than evaporation, you get forest. If you have cool summers, it's boreal forest, and warmer summers, it's temperate forest. So this is the current climate envelopes for boreal forest, mixed boreal, temperate forest, and prairie in this region. And the question is, what's going to happen with climate change? And notice that almost all of Iowa is a forest climate, and so is southwestern Minnesota. And that's because in the early part of climate change, we started getting more precipitation, but most of the warming was in winter, which doesn't facilitate higher evaporation levels. So the climate actually feels wetter to the vegetation, and so it's a forest climate even out in southwestern Minnesota. So people are fighting to keep trees out of their prairie remnants. But the question is, what's going to happen in the future with climate change? Well, for a low emission scenario, not much. The biomes move a little bit, maybe 20 to 50 miles to the north and east by 2070. But for a high emission or business as usual scenario, Minnesota becomes the new Kansas, as you can see here, with all this dark reddish brown, which is a climate that will only support prairie. You'd still have some oak in the Arrowhead, oak and maple forest there, a little bit in the driftless area because of the big hills. The north sides of the hills are cooler. But basically, that's the new Kansas right there that I told a reporter from the Washington Post that we had a perfectly good Kansas now, and we don't need a second Kansas in Minnesota. And that ended up being on the front page in an article that the Washington Post did about climate change. And that's when I found out what it's like to get feedback from all around the world. And discovered that half of all the people in the world think I'm an idiot, and the other half think I'm a brilliant scientist. So that's where we're headed. If we're headed on the business as usual scenario in this part of the world, because we're not far from the prairie forest border, our forests might not have much of a future here. So invasive species, deer, fragmentation, climate change, and these lead to the extinction debt. And what is an extinction debt? And why am I showing you a woolly mammoth? Well, they went extinct. They lived here 14,000 years ago in Minnesota. And this is the proof. It was a fossil from Albert Lee, and you can see they had this huge range in the light green. Across most of Europe and Asia and North America. And by 4,000 years ago, there were just two populations on Wrangel Island and St. Paul Island. The climate had changed. Their population, there was probably some hunting by people, but the climate changed, their habitat changed, and they went down to just two islands. So these last two populations blinked out about 14,000 years ago due to genetic inbreeding in one case and random change in the environment in the other of these two islands. And from 10,000 years ago to 4,000 years ago, woolly mammoths were part of the extinction debt. They only lived on those two little islands. In other words, they were doomed to extinction because there wasn't enough habitat to support them. But the existing populations could keep kind of going along, even though they were ultimately doomed. And that's the case, we think, for 50% of all our native plant species. And again, those are essential to forest function. The more diversity of those you have, the more diverse the pollinator network, the more diverse the fungi, the more diverse the insects and birds, everything in the ecosystem, soil function, it all hinges on plant diversity. And with 98% of the big woods gone, we can expect to lose 50% of the species. And in the metro area, we probably already lost that just from the deer and the worms. So I'm looking at big woods remnants and how many of them are bare like this one here, how many of them are lush like the one down in the Cannon River, and so on. So the overall question is, can we get all the native species to survive in a tiny percent of the original area? Can we manage these forests to do that, to counteract the impacts of deer fragmentation and climate change? Well, it's easy to manage deer. It's not politically easy. It's easy to do in practice if you can get permission to do it. The worms are really hard to manage, though. Let's see, I think I'll just skip, I'll just show this. This is area on the x-axis and number of species here. The pre-European settlement species area curve was like that. And the extinction debt caused by the loss of habitat brings it down to there. And then the deer and the worms and the fragmentation bring it down to there. So we have a new species area curve like that, which with a reduced habitat area compared to the pre-European. But we want is this one. We want to see if we can keep all the species, but in this reduced area, where we used to have this bigger area here on this logarithmic scale. Now we have this much reduced area. And instead of having that many species, we want that many species. We don't want our species to go extinct. One solution is to restore native plants in as many places as possible, including all the woods that are in your watershed district. This could be tried. We've had some pretty good success research-wise in restoring native plants. We discovered if you put the seed source back in there after the standing crop had been wiped out by the combination of fragmentation and deer and worms, that they actually can grow there. They might still be disturbed by the deer, but they actually can grow there. They can actually compete with buckthorn. If you remove the buckthorn and seed in native plants, you can actually get a plant community that's not all buckthorn, that just has a few buckthorn. The native species can compete, but they have to be there to do that, obviously. And if a species is in many locations, it becomes invulnerable to extinction. So every woodland remnant, we should look into what species are there and can we restore any of the native plant species. Just to take things to an extreme, I decided to establish a restored little fragment of forest in the middle of downtown Minneapolis, just to show it can be done anywhere. And this is a garden here on the north side of the condo where I live in downtown Minneapolis. We got some people to donate money. We got 100 volunteers from Target headquarters. And we established the woodland wildflower garden, and these are some of the plants it has: wild geranium, Solomon seal, goat's beard, ginger, woodland phlox, white snakeroot, yellow violet, Canada violet, sweet cicely, which is also called anise root, zigzag, goldenrod, mayapple, sedges, spikenard, columbine, lady fern, shorts, aster, and Chandler's nightshade. and believe it or not, they're all growing really well, and they're actually reproducing. And I have produced like 1/100th of an acre of self-perpetuating native ecosystem in the middle, native bigwoods ecosystem right in downtown Minneapolis. So it can be done. So to forego this extinction debt, preserve existing bigwoods occurrences, create native plant restorations, and do it in many locations so that there can be genetic exchange between populations, learn about and manage the invasive species and manage the deer. And I think if we do those things, we can forego the extinction debt. It's not a debt you want to pay. If you pay the extinction debt, that means your species went extinct. And we could retain the function of our forests. Maybe we could even learn to stop the soil erosion. So we are actually applying for a grant from the Terrestrial Invasive Species Center to plant some native plant species on jumping worm infested slopes at the Arboretum. So they have some maple forest there, sugar maple, basswood, and red oak. Very steep slopes. The soil is eroding away very fast. And what we want to do is plant some native plants there, measure the erosion rate, compare it to no plants, and also compare it to areas not infested with jumping worms that are just infested with European worms, and actually measure the soil erosion rate and see to what extent can we reduce it by restoring native plants in the understory of these forests. And at the same time create more sites where the native species are present so that they're less likely to go extinct. And of course, water quality depends on soil erosion, which depends on earthworms, on earthworm invasion, and it depends on plant cover, right? It's not enough just to have tree cover to stop erosion. You have to have the understory plant layer to do that. So are there any questions? I thought people might jump in, but then I did talk pretty fast. So.
Yeah. We didn't want to interrupt you.
Yeah, I got a good momentum going there.
I have a really quick question.
So what do we do?
Well,
Can we get a plant list, or I mean?
Yeah, there are plant lists are available, and plant lists for, there are certain plant species that are widely available in nurseries these days. Native plants are becoming more available. Native seed is becoming more available than it was. So, I think you probably could restore an understory with, say, wood nettle and wild geranium and ginger and columbine and pen sedge, for example. If you have any forests with a bare understory, I think you could do that. You could start small and spread, sometimes people try to do too big an area and plant it too low a density. It's better to plant a high density in a small area and kind of gradually spread. Because if you want to restore 40 acres and you need 1,000 plants per acre, you're probably not going to find 40,000 plants in a native plant nursery. But so start small and spread. So let's see here.
So we've got a couple people in this group that have been working to get rid of buckthorn, Sharon and Marilyn, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you're suggesting we put down seed, or should we put in some plugs?
Well, we have a research program on restoration after buckthorn removal. I can actually send you a couple of the publications from that. That one's been going on for several years. It's called Cover It Up. Cut the buckthorn, shred the stumps as much as you can. We discovered that if you cut the stems cleanly, they resprout way more than if you have a grinder and you shatter the stems. So that they're all fragmented into little strips. And plant native seed or plant native plants, because if you don't, the buckthorn's going to come right back because there are buckthorn seeds in the soil. And what's the point of getting rid of buckthorn if you then just end up with totally bare soil? So, yeah, so Stantec Corporation has been a collaborator in our research, and they've been doing native seeding of native plants at a large scale, say 10 to 40 acre scale, as part of our research, and they've been doing it for the city of Roseville. So remove the buckthorn, put in seeds of native plants, maybe do a weeding of buckthorn a year or two later, and then end up with a native plant understory.
Dr. Frelich?
Yeah.
This is Liz. So I had a couple of questions. Well, one statement. So if you would share any relevant articles with me, I'll make sure the entire group gets them, including those who are unable to attend tonight. And do you were talking about the example, the 1/100th of an acre in downtown Minneapolis outside your condo. Do you have a white paper or a web page or something that summarizes that? Because I think that's something we really need to emphasize to people, is that you can start small in your yard and create huge change.
Yeah.
So if you have something like that you could share as well, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, I don't, but I could take that chunk of slides though and make it into a PDF, and that might serve that purpose.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, and that site is jumping worm infested. And one thing I discovered, if you plant your plants in a jumping worm infested site and you walk through it, you will uproot the plants because the soil is like cat litter. So you have to be really, really careful. And I did put a chicken wire fence around it to keep rabbits out. I mean, you don't have rabbits in a forest usually, they stay at the edge, but of course, being 100th of an acre, it is an edge. So
are those plants then surviving despite the presence of jumping worms?
yes, they're surviving with jumping worms in deep shade. So yeah, I'm pretty happy. I mean, even poke milkweed, it's amazing. And you know, there's variation in light. Some of the brighter areas I put more zigzag goldenrod and swamp milkweed and more columbine, and then the more deeply shaded areas I put things like ginger and woodland phlox. And so I'm a plant ecologist. You know, I automatically put each plant in the right spot. If there's a sun fleck there, I'll put an aster there, and if there isn't a sun fleck, I'll put ginger. So
what makes me very excited, because we moved last year and I'm doing a lot of native habitat gardens in my area, so I'm very happy to hear it, because I did notice we have a ton of night crawlers. They just, our leaf litter out here just disappeared this spring, just like right away. So
yep.
I believe Sharon, you had your hand up next.
Yeah, it looks like there's like 3 people with their hands
we got
up,
Sharon, Savannah, and then Arnie and Louise up next.
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Frelich. A quick question. We do, as folks were saying, we do a lot of buckthorn and garlic mustard pulls. And when you're talking to people, I've always said, well, when we remove that, it allows space for native plants to grow. They have better root systems, da 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 da. But we had heard there that those two particular plants do a really big disruption to the soil content or balance or something. So is there another quick 1-sentence thing you can tell me, so that when we're side by side with regular people who aren't scientists, that we can just say how it impacts the soil content? Because I think, to me, that's equally as important as the other piece.
Yeah, there are chemicals in the leaves of both of those plant species.
Okay.
Emodin is the chemical that's in buckthorn, and it probably has negative effects on some plant species. It probably has negative effects on salamanders. And then there's also a change in the mycorrhizal community of fungi. So yeah, there are changes in the soil, but within a few years after the buckthorn is gone, those changes progressively disappear because those chemicals are broken down by bacteria and so on. So it's not necessarily persistent, and so you can bring the native plants back in.
Better story even. So thank you. I like ending it on that's why we're doing it. Over time, it will improve the soil. Thank you.
Yeah, and then it looks like
Savannah? Yeah, we have
Savannah
Savannah
was
up next.
next. Yeah.
So I have a quick question about the sample garden or the like garden that you put in Minneapolis, and then a follow-up question about kind of a similar question to the one that Sharon asked. And that is, were there already invasive species that you had to remove from the area that you put your garden in Minneapolis?
The garden in Minneapolis was a hosta garden. And it took a lot of persuasion for the people who lived in the neighborhood to get rid of those darn hostas. But I said, the hostas are like plastic that grows, and they're great, they're decorative, it's a nice thing to have on the walkway up to the front door of your house. But they shouldn't take up all the space where there's shade. I mean, we have hundreds of native species of plants that grow in shaded habitats in the big woods, and they deserve their share of space. So they agreed to transplant these hostas elsewhere, and now we have 30 different species of native bigwoods that are self-reproducing at just amazing rates. The yellow violets are going crazy. The sweet Sicily, this produces hundreds of baby plants every year, and the ginger is spreading. Let me turn my phone off. So everything is doing really well there, but it was a hosta garden. But for our research, and this is in parks in Roseville and other suburbs, we did have to remove buckthorn to establish native plants. And that's been successful too. You can't pay as much attention to each plant, and you have to use certain species that are more likely to grow fast early on and become well established. So it can work if you're removing buckthorn.
Yeah. And do you have to do anything about the potential loss of nutrients from the invasive species, or are the native species pretty sufficient without any intervention?
Yeah, the nutrient loss depends on your soil type. So if you're in a really good silt loam soil, even with the nutrient loss, there still might be high enough nutrient levels that it's fine. Whether or not you want to fertilize when you plant has both benefits and negative impacts. Might benefit the establishment and growth of the plants. It might also attract the deer even more to those plants because deer can sense the amount of nitrogen in plant leaves. If you're on a soil that's not quite so rich, the nutrient loss might be significant, and you might have a smaller species list. I think the things like the geranium and the columbine and the zigzag goldenrod are able to grow on soils with a little bit less nutrients. So you can still plant a bunch of species and they'll kind of self-adjust. Wood nettle definitely isn't going to do well if it's a drier site with a less silt in the soil, whereas that might do really well if you're on a lower slope and you have a lot of silt in the soil. You might get wood nettle to really take off and cover everything, which is great. I mean, people complain about walking through it, but on the soils that have a high silt content and a high water holding content, it will form a massive cover and it will hold the soil. And if it's massive enough, the deer can eat it and not affect it, because the deer eat it from the top and the lower part of the plant stays alive. Whereas for a trillium, if the deer eat it from the top, they just took all the leaves, right? And the plant dies, or it comes up only 2 inches tall the next year. But things like wood nettle are pretty resistant to deer. They do need the wetter sites, but like I said, the zigzag goldenrod, the columbine, the woodland phlox can do better on the soils that aren't quite so rich, I think. So you can fine tune things, and we have a lot to learn, but I think every site can be restored. I mean, for sites that are a little bit drier and maybe hilltops, you might go with hog peanut. Makes its own nitrogen. I mean, it's in the legume family. It's a nitrogen fixer, and I've noticed in natural areas that some of the drier hilltop sites are starting to fill in with hog peanut just under natural conditions. So we have a lot to learn about this type of restoration, but we're getting there. Let's see, who is next?
Louise and Arnie are next.
Yeah.
Hi. I hail from Seattle, and we had a lot of problems with blackberries out there. Folks went and picked blackberries all along the railroad tracks, and that was a really bad idea because of all the stuff that the trains emitted. But blackberries spread like crazy, much like buckthorn. And the only way that I was able to deal with the blackberries was to just nuke them with vinegar and salt. And that was the easiest way to get rid of them. They withered up and they died.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I had to say.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that might be a way of getting rid of some invasive plants. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to get rid of garlic mustard, a lot of different ways to get rid of buckthorn. You can paint herbicides or various chemicals on the stumps after you cut them, or you can even paint it on the bark on smaller buckthorn where the bark is still thin and it'll soak through.
Well, I really wanted to get away from using any chemicals like, the phosphates or the Monsanto crap. And so
Yeah.
I just used the simplest I could, a little bit of water, a whole lot of vinegar, and a whole lot of salt. Kosher salt.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that vinegar would, if you spray it on the leaves, it would cause all the leaves to die, and then the plant would probably die. I was going to
No. I dumped it. I dumped it to get to the roots.
Oh, so you killed the roots, killed the root hairs. Yeah,
Oh,
well, you can do that too. You can kill
Oh,
the
yeah.
root hairs too. With that, yeah, it's just in that case, it's just a strong dose of acid rain. But the thing about
Exactly.
blackberries is, in Minnesota, they can be a good native plant to come in to help hold the soil. But it has to be the more open forest type. So you'd be talking more about the oak forest on south-facing slopes, maybe, not the really rich silt loam sites that have a lot of maple. You could get blackberries to grow there, and they could be the thing that holds the soil and that competes with the buckthorn. And
My God, you do not want blackberries growing anywhere.
well,
Trust me. Trust me. They are so invasive, they will spread across your neighbor's house.
yeah,
They're
well,
worse than Charlie.
on some sites, you want that though. So on some of these south-facing kind of oak sites where the trees aren't very dense, blackberries are a good first step, and then other trees can come in and they'll shade out the blackberries. And I've done some of those restorations too.
Dr.
Well,
Hey, my turn. Dr. Frelich, I had a question I had the question and it seems to lead in quite well to what we just heard about. But for a lot of forest restorations, glyphosate has been used to treat buckthorn. Like I, in my own yard, do cut stumps of the smaller buckthorn and then treat the outer edge where the living tissue is to kill the roots. And I heard you mention the also with the grinding up of the stumps. Would something like a for a large scale restoration, like a bringing in a forest mower, have you seen I guess a better management occur when you are using a combination of both mechanical and herbicide treatments?
Oh,
What do you,
definitely.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you have one of those big rolling things with all the big teeth on it, and I forget what it's called, and it, essentially shreds the stumps,
Mhm.
they won't sprout, and you'll get some seed germination, but you can do a very light application of whatever chemical you want the next year and get rid of those, or you can pull them.
Mhm.
Once you get the native plants in there, then the density of the germinating buckthorn becomes much lower, and it becomes feasible actually to just go and hand pull them when they're small.
Gotcha. Yep. Yeah, and
So,
I worked for the city of Burnsville for 8 years, and the city has been doing a lot of large scale oak savanna restorations by removal of buckthorn, and so using that forest roller as well as doing some follow up foliar sprays for after the native plants have gone dormant. And the buckthorn is still active. But for people that are voicing concerns about using an herbicide, what are your thoughts on using herbicides in a fashion to control invasive species in I say an appropriate manner, using it in an appropriate manner?
yeah, I think if you're limiting the application, like you're painting it on stumps, or you're doing a one-time application, I don't think it's very damaging to the environment. I think the environment is damaged in places like cornfields where you're spraying it wall to wall every year, and it's building up in the environment. Whereas one-time applications, the microbiome in the soil can break it down. So you're not going to have the long-term impacts that you get with the massive use like they do in agricultural fields.
Okay, thank you. And I believe Marilyn was up next.
Yeah, you're muted.
I was just wondering about the use of mulch. So we usually recommend, like if you're replacing turf grass, to smother it with many layers of newspaper and put mulch down and plant. But first of all, what did you do in your urban garden, and what can you do on restorations when there's no leaf litter left?
Yeah,
And
well,
how, yeah.
yeah, I didn't use any mulch in my restoration, and I don't think you necessarily have to if you're in a forest with a high quality soil. I think you can get the native plants to go at a high enough density within a few years that you don't need mulch. One of the new problems with mulch that has just come up in the last few years is that jumping worms love mulch, and we discovered they can detect it from some distance and head towards it, because at the Arboretum, they trim their trees during the winter, and then in the spring they chip those tree branches and they make a mulch or a wood chip pile. Well, they made a wood chip pile in the middle of a parking lot, and 2 weeks later it was filled with jumping worms that had crawled across the asphalt on the parking lot. They must be able to smell wood chips. They love wood chips so much. It's just amazing. If you put wood chips down, they will come. So
So you don't recommend any,
Well, if you don't have any jumping worms for hundreds of feet in any direction, it might be okay. But if the jumping worms are in the area and you put down mulch, the jumping worms will find it and they will reproduce massively in underneath that mulch.
interesting. Interesting. And you mentioned fast growing and fast spreading plants. Are those the usual, the ginger and
Yeah, I think, yeah, pen
Virginia
sedge,
waterleaf and
yeah, waterleaf, pen sedge, ginger,
so your typical ground covers. Okay.
spread pretty fast. Woodland phlox spreads pretty fast. But after just a couple of years, things like zigzag goldenrod will start spreading pretty fast. In my experience, and even sweet Sicily, it's more a matter of getting the right plant in the right place. I think if you put a plant in a place that it likes, it will spread.
Okay.
And enchanter's nightshade. Enchanter's nightshade, could cover an acre in a year. I mean,
Is that native?
yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not in the nightshade family. It just happens to have the name nightshade. It gets a little white flower. It's about a foot tall, and it has spread so much that I'm now donating hundreds of plants of it to other gardens because it's taking over, and I'm having to thin it out so that the other plants can grow. So if you're trying to do a large restoration, that might be an ideal plant. It spreads both by rhizomes and by seed. I mean, the seeds germinate like crazy and the rhizomes go everywhere. So that's a good one too. And it can tolerate pretty deep shade. It's a little bit drought sensitive, so it might not do well if there's a higher sand content or if it's on the top of a hill compared to like side hills and lower hills.
Okay. Great. I could go on, but it's Andrew's turn.
Oh. Well, thank you. I just want to go back to the beginning and what we heard about the buckthorn and the symbiotic relationship it has with the earthworms and how it's pretty devastating in there to have them both together, and that you remove the buckthorn, you put in the native plants for your new ecosystem. What kind of plants, what impact does it have? You were talking about the kitty litter impact and how if you're walking through there, is that going to go away eventually due to the native plantings? Do these worms kind of move off on their own? Is there a way to control them once they're in, or are we just done?
I think if you can get the native plants established with the worms and learn to live with the worms, because the chemicals you would have to apply to get rid of the worms would really be massive. So we're doing some trials with different chemicals for invasive earthworms, and it turns out saponins are one of the best. And they're saponins are natural chemicals that are in tea leaves. So billions of people consume saponins every year, and the more tea you drink, the longer you live. So it's not a health problem. And they use them on golf course greens to get rid of earthworms that would otherwise make those little piles of casting so the ball wouldn't roll right. So saponins are pretty safe if you really have to get rid of worms in a small garden setting. But I'd say in a bigger setting, it's probably better. If you're trying to restore a whole woodland, it's probably better to learn to live with the worms. Hope that the plants will anchor the soil, and that, and I'm finding that they're getting along with jumping worms. Now, when the jumping worms come in, the night crawlers disappear. So they can't compete with the jumping worms, but then you have the jumping worms instead. So you have a large bodied, highly active worm species in either case. The jumping worms might be worse because they cause the slope to slump down really fast. I mean, these slopes at the Arboretum, there's one slope that's fairly steep and it's all sugar maple forest. You can literally step on top of the slope and wiggle your feet and you will slide down as if you were on an escalator. That's what the jumping worms do to the soil. So when we submitted this proposal to try to see if we can plant native plants and measure the erosion rates and try to document a restoration strategy, the funding agency was pretty happy about that. And when I asked managers for letters of support, they were like, yes, I want to write a letter of support for this research. Like John Moriarty at Three Rivers Parks, he sent back an email immediately. Yes, just tell me what to say in the letter. I want that research. And furthermore, you can use one of my infested sites as one of your research sites. So we need to learn a lot about it, but I think it can work based on my experience in this, what has become a trial garden here. These plants are all persisting in the presence of jumping worms.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we let Dr. Frelich enjoy his evening offline?
Thank you so much.
I wondered if you had students that would be interested in coming to help us look at it and maybe set some metrics or what kind of a strategic plan for how we should be approaching some restoration and what we can do.
Well, I would say once we get this grant, $400,000 grant from the Terrestrial Invasive Species Center, it would be appropriate to look at some other sites. I mean, maybe you have a site that we could use for part of the research, for example.
Okay.
But I would see that as probably being next summer or maybe this fall. I'm not sure exactly when we're going to hear about the grant, but
Well, keep us in mind if there's, but even just guidance for, those.
Certainly looking at a wider variety of field sites is always informative for us.
Riley Creek Woods has lots of wood nettle, a really healthy ground cover of wood nettle.
Well, if you have good wood nettle, you're lucky. Yeah, that'll help a lot. I haven't seen a wood nettle site invaded with jumping worms, though, and if you have one of those, it'd be really interesting to see what happens there.
Well, I hope you can't study it right.
Can you put that solution down with the mustard and what you use for earthworms?
It's just about a cup of the ground yellow mustard powder in a gallon of water. So we buy the mustard powder in bulk. I mean, if you try to buy it in those little things that you use for baking, it'll cost you $1,000. But if you buy it in bulk at a place that sells mustard powder to restaurants and buy it in a bigger container, it's less expensive per unit. So that's what we do, and you mix it just before you pour it on the ground, and you want to pour it on an area that's like about a square foot. Pour like a third of it, wait a few minutes, see how many worms come up, pour a little more. If you have a lot of clay in the soil, it might take, a half an hour for the water to soak in. If you have a loamy soil with a fair amount of sand, it might soak in right away. But you want it to soak in and not run off. And worms will come to the surface, and then you can see how many there are. I mean, that's just for the purpose of sampling earthworms.
Is that 1 cup powder to a gallon of water?
Yeah. Actually, a half a cup would work. I I think we're using a half a cup, come to think of it, half a cup in a gallon of water. So, yeah. And that's just for the purpose of seeing how many worms are there.
Mhm.
No,
It
and
doesn't kill them.
it might kill a few of them, but it's more of a sampling technique than a control technique. We use sampling rings, which are about that big, and they're just like slices of a big PVC pipe that's like 10 or 12 inches diameter. And we just have somebody in the lab make it into 2-inch slices and then have them bevel one side so that you can kind of work it in the soil a 1/2 inch and then pour the water in that, because then you have a known area. And then you can extrapolate to, if you do like 5 of those samples and you know the area of that, then you can extrapolate to how many worms you have per acre or whatever. And that's where in a typical maple forest around here, again, we'd have about 100,000 night crawlers per acre and 200,000 or 300,000 of the endogeic worms, the Aporectidea per acre. And jumping worms, we're not totally sure yet. By August, it would probably, depends on how rainy it is, because they stay close to the surface and they're very sensitive to whether it's a rainy summer or not. So we've only been getting like 10,000 per acre the last 2 summers, but in 2019 and 2020, we were getting 100,000 or 200,000 when we had rainy summers. They'll actually mature and lay eggs. The eggs will hatch and then mature within 1 growing season. So if you get a summer where it rains all summer, you can have a huge number of them by September. And if you have a summer like last summer, you might only have a few per acre. But they don't go away. They will make a comeback as soon as it starts raining normally again.
Anything else for Dr. Frelich?
Yeah, this is Jim. Real quick, this is a different kind of invasive species. It's rabbits, and this winter, for the first time in 23 years, they ate all the bark off our apple trees, about 12 to 15 inches up. Number one, without eating a lot of Hassenpfeffer this winter, is there a way to keep them from doing that again and saving the tree? We have a tree care service coming out in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, well,
we've been told it's really tough. We moved in, like I said, 23 years ago. The trees are probably 28 years old. They haven't been producing, maybe every other year. It's I don't remember the apple trees, the apple name. It's something that was designed to grow in the state of Minnesota. But
yeah,
looking at
well,
this in the future, if we can we save the tree? Have you seen this? And
well,
what do we do about the critters?
If it's deeply girdled all the way around, the tree will probably die, might send up some sprouts, which may or may not hold true to the same type of apple, depending on what it was grafted onto. The way to save the tree is to put chicken wire around it in the fall. Now, if you have as much snow as we had last winter, I saw a rabbit browsing like where people piled up snow like 5 feet above the ground as the rabbits just climbed up the snow.
Right.
And rabbits love things in the rose family. Apples
Yeah,
are
they
in the
hit
rose family.
our hydrangeas too.
Yeah,
Our
well,
hydrangea bush.
they were probably starving this winter, so they would eat anything because the snow was so deep and they couldn't get their normal food. So, but they love anything in the rose family more than anything else. And so in my neighborhood, we routinely put chicken wire around all apple, cherry, flowering crab, anything, pear, anything in the rose family. We just routinely do that every fall.
Okay. And eat a lot of Hassenpfeffer.
Yep.
All right, with that, well, thank you, Dr. Frelich. It was a really great presentation and really great questions, and I know everyone appreciates very much your attendance tonight, and I look forward to seeing what you send along as far as like publications or any other materials that you can provide, and I will share those with the group. Thank you so much.
Yep, you're welcome. Bye.
All right,
Bye-bye.
bye.
Thank you.